Welcome. Hello. I'm here to talk to you about how should artists use emotion as method. And my name is Christian Nold. That's me. I work as a practitioner for a long time. I've moved to academia fairly recently to do my PhD. And really, it was to work on emotion to try and change the world. And I thought I could do that within academia as well as in the art world. So nowadays I teach design at the Open University in the UK. Come and do a PhD with me. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a typology for using emotion as a method. And I'll explain that um, in a lot more detail. I'm going to do that by showing you some of my art and design work. So yes, emotion. What's emotion? Well, emotion can mean very many different things. Emotion is something we talk about in personal relationships with other people. There's a long history of talking about emotion in lots of academic disciplines. But today I want to talk about emotion in a very specific way. I want to talk about it as something material, as something embodied, and as something that can be displayed and it can intervene and act in the world. And I'm using it in the sense of Spinoza, who really talked about it as this embodied state. So it's not just an internal mental thing, but something that's really physical, material. We can observe its use in the world. But rather than talking about what emotion is, what I really want to talk about is what emotion does. And that's really the focus of this talk. So these days, many of us have these kind of devices on our wrists that measure something about our body, tell us something about emotional and our physical states, and externalize it in a particular way. Your heart rate, but also your exhaustion, lots of things that are kind of your body is kind of producing, and these kind of devices can measure. But my interest is really to try and look at some of the other languages that we could use to think about this rather than these kind of digital devices. So there's a much older language. This is from 1654, A Map of Tenderness. And it was from a literary work that really talked about relationship developing as these kind of city stages past the Lake of Indifference. And at the top, there, I think the fallopian tubes indicating conception. So this was a kind of poetic, literary idea of projecting emotion onto the landscape. But there's other examples. This is the same kind of time, 1613. This was a song of England, where the rivers and the forests are represented as these kind of nymph creatures. But I think they show us a sort of lived vision of life. People doing kind of cutting down grains, enjoying themselves doing things. So it's a very different vision than we see of maps normally. We don't normally see people represented on maps and that kind of lived experience. So really what I'm talking about is how do we represent emotion as this kind of external thing that we experience all the time in life, but that's embodied and in the world. So when I talk about a typology of emotion assemblages, what I mean is that there's different ways in which you can stage emotion. What I mean by staging emotion is there's different ways of measuring it, different ways of using it to do different objectives in different disciplines. So I have five different typologies that I'd like to talk about today. In the laboratory, a public typology of using emotion, a gallery one, a cultural one, and a community one. And as you can see, they get a little bit more complicated as we go along. So my suggestion is that there's lots of different ones. It doesn't have to be five, but this just helps us to talk about it. And this comes from a particular paper that I wrote called Typology of Emotion Assemblages in Art and Science, if you want to know more about this. So, first of all, laboratory emotion. What I mean really is a particular relationship where a participant is often shown some kind of emotive stimulus, and then there's some kind of process, some kind of scientific device that's recording how they're responding. So these are kind of brain imaging, for example, to look at that kind of emotive stimulus in the brain, but also looking at facial recognition, for example. which is something that's used a lot in kind of computing software these days. Or in the classic lie detector test, which kind of uses blood pressure and your breathing rate and your sweat level on your skin. But what's important about the kind of laboratory assemblage is that the participant is sitting there and their data is looked at by somebody else, in this case, the researcher, who's kind of off screen there. So there's some kind of asymmetry there. And the subject and the researcher are not really collaborating. They have different agendas here. And this is how I kind of visualize it. You have participants, you have an emotion capture, and then you have some statistical analysis. In the public emotion assemblage, it's really about aggregating emotion. So this is a particular art project called We Feel Fine by Jonathan Harris. And it really kind of goes and kind of scrapes a lot of public browsers to look at emotive words and tries to represent some overall sense of how people and the public is feeling. I feel so alone, and this is just another time when I want to go hide where no one will ever find me. So what's happening in this particular assemblage is you have participants, their emotion is kind of captured or scraped like this, and then there's some kind of aggregate analysis. But again, the participants are not involved in creating these visualizations or any of this process. Their emotion is used, but it's used en masse. So this is really about the aggregate, and the visualization is important for this. So for the next typology, gallery emotion, there's a little video I found by Xijing Bao. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know. This is a video of an art piece. I'll just show you a little bit of it. It's an installation basically that was created, I think, in relation to COVID and a lot of the kind of feelings in relation to that COVID was bringing up. But what's key about it, it's an immersive interactive space where the person is sitting in the space and they're seeing some kind of generative artwork like this going on. But the way it works is that the computer is actually reading the facial there we go, you can see it here, is basically doing some kind of facial expression analysis in order to do a feedback loop. So the projections are actually being driven by the person. So there's the participant, some kind of emotion capture, the multimedia artwork, and there's a feedback loop going on. So my argument is that there's something much more interactive going on here, where the participants are involved in producing the artwork and involved in the whole process itself. But again, the researcher artist is kind of not part of this. They're somehow off the stage somewhat. In the cultural emotion assemblage, you often used in the social sciences, the researcher is there. The researcher is observing and is part of the whole process that's taking place. They're interviewing often. And my argument is that there's a sort of cultural situation that's being investigated. That's what brings the participants into that context. And the researcher is there observing the participants and reflecting on their own emotion as well as the participants. So the researcher is often self-reflexive in this assemblage. And the end result is qualitative analysis. So I would say what's distinctive about this assemblage is the researcher being part of it. But again, the participants are not really involved in directly producing the outputs of these kind of emotion work that's taking place. In community emotion, this is sort of the most complicated one, the one that I'm going to talk about my work in the relation to, is the participants and the artist are kind of together collaboratively staging something. And it's in relation to a particular historic environmental situation. So there is some kind of problem, some kind of context, and the participants are involved in some process where their emotion is kind of generating something along with the artist who's staging something, and they're collectively contributing towards something. So I'll try and illustrate that with this project I'm going to talk about. So this is my biomapping device that I built quite a long time ago now, and I've used with thousands of people all over the world. I think I've staged a project in, I think about 11 countries all over. Um, and basically what it does, the thing on your fingers measures your sweat level, your galvanic skin response. So it's looking for changes in sweat level as an indicator of some kind of internal state or some kind of embodied material state. The device is also measuring your location. It has a GPS unit. So it measures something about your body and your location at the same time. So the way it works is that I would send people off like this, wired up to these devices to go for a walk in their local area. Like this, here they're just walking by themselves, looking around, seeing how they're feeling in relation to each other, in relation to the environment. And when they come back, the data's downloaded and they see something like this. They see something like a cardiogram. I mean, it's not your heart rate, but you see some kind of something of your body, but it's projected across the landscape. So actually what's happening is the rate of physiological change is being displayed. So when there's a lot of change in the sweat level on your fingers, that becomes a really high peak, a high spike. And of course, because we have the GPS location, we can plot it spatially like this. Now that's interesting, but where it becomes fascinating, I think, is when people start talking about it and start making sense of this. So this person is looking at this kind of track and interpreting it. They're interpreting what they experienced in relation to the track that they see in front of them. And then suddenly there's a sense-making process going on. So that particular peak here, the participant was talking about they were really an argument with their mum. That was the thing that was really triggering here, or the fact that they have driving lessons over there, or some other events taking place near where they live, or all sorts of events that people talk about. Here was a person who didn't have a t-shirt on, seemed to be causing one of the major spikes. So I'm showing you maps from different places, and these are displayed in Google Earth that I downloaded and projected my data into from the biomapping device. Something else exciting happens once you start overlaying lots of people's tracks. So this is in Greenwich in London, where I worked with 100 people to explore the local area. And this is an area where there's lots of regeneration taking place, and there's lots of concerns about gentrification, i.e. the area is changing, and a lot of the old housing and a lot of the old places are disappearing, and people are concerned about this. So we produced a Greenwich emotion map to really capture all these experiences, both people's verbal descriptions and text, as well as these kind of emotive data. And this is what the Greenwich emotion map looks like. So this is in 2005, 2006. And what you see is basically a landscape made out of people's physiological arousal, overlaid with these textual annotations. Those red squares are where people were taking photographs. So there, for example, is the Millennium Cafe, which was a big center that people cared about. It was a place where this Millennium Cafe is, people think it's going to be destroyed as part of the development that's taking place in the area, and people cared about it. You can see from the red kind of contours, it's a point of high physiological arousal. It's something that people noted and cared about. And this was not just one person, this is multiple people going for a walk. And you see the different tracks overlaid, kind of creating an emotional landscape, an emotional cartography of the area. And this is fascinating once you start talking in a group about this local area and through these maps. And to think about it again as an assemblage, I've used this approach in many places, as I mentioned, across the world in many cities with many people. And it's always different wherever you stage it because you have different components being put into the assemblage. So in Paris, for example, it was very much about the cemeteries. That was really one of the key points that people were talking about during their walks, all the different encounters that happened in these cemeteries, which were very diverse, romantic relationships, blossoming trees, statues, kind of memories of a person that was buried there. All kinds of very different experiences, different people going for a walk, and it's a high intensity, high experience area. Or here, for example, this is a square in Paris where you have two different demonstrations happening on two different days. One was a Berber demonstration, and the other one was a Chinese demonstration. And they both took place in the same square, not at the same time, but following each other. So the square was really this focus for these two very different social gatherings and a high emotion area. Yeah, there's a little bit more. There's also sort of lots of dog poo in the street is always something that people comment on as well. This is in San Francisco, and you can see the kind of grid layout of the city. And you can see basically the high arousal areas on the intersections. So just to show you one of them here in a bit more detail, you have jaywalking evangelists, smiled at two guys playing a guitar, put money into meters, saw McDonald's skateboarders, gorgeous red couch, got excited watching skateboarders. I saw Josh in the corner, running a little in BART stop, saw the revolutionary pickup truck, went into the bank, got hot and took my jacket off, Foxy Lady Boutique, all sorts of different events, small things, but all structured by the city. So that's really about people's bodies and the city together. Or here, for example, in the center, I was remembering a person I had a major relationship with whose parents lived here. The person really felt something walking past this house, and it's recorded on the map in this way. Or here, there are these small graffiti roads, which seem to be a high arousal area in San Francisco in the Mission District. In Stockport, we worked slightly differently. We also included people's drawings. So people were asked to do drawings. So the physiological arousal is these kind of bars, which is really sharing a space with these kind of drawings made by local people and the comments all overlaid with each other and the jaggedy lines of the GPS traces. In Brentford, for example, it really became a question about how do we talk about the historical context of the site, and it became much more about planning and how's the emotional experience of that place structured through the history of how this thing came to be. So you have the emotion data as well as some of these stories and some of the sense making, some of these graphics and graphs that people were producing to make sense of the place, as well as future visions about wanting to transform that little area, which is in the west of London. I gathered some of these stories and thoughts in my emotional cartography book, if you want to have a look at that. Just to kind of wrap up, my argument is that this is the community assemblage, where participants are trying to work out how they are making sense of the environment together. The artist is part of this whole process, and the artists, the devices, the machines are co-constructing a particular vision of an emotional landscape together. That's kind of structured through historic environmental situation. So my argument is that this is quite different to the other compositions we saw, some of the different assemblages. Here they are again. So my argument is this. Each assemblage shapes participation in a different way. They enable or limit who can play, analyze, reflect, or intervene. And artists and designers must choose their assemblage carefully, as it determines what kinds of actions are possible. What kind of worlds can we build? And how can we change the world through the emotion assemblages that we create? So if you want to know more, here is that paper again that I mentioned, Typology of Emotion Assemblages in Art and Science. Thanks very much.